Hello, I am Jyotika. Welcome to Excelling Psychology. In this lesson, we will go through Unit 1 of Clinical Psychology. Right at the beginning, I want you to know that learning only this lesson will not help you to answer well in the papers. You will have to go through thoroughly what is given in your textbook. You can take this as a supplementary lesson or just to understand better whatever you're learning in the textbook. Don't take this as the only lesson to prepare well for the paper. In this video, I will be covering the first 3 subtopics under schizophrenia, which include the ICD-11 criteria, the Aneja et al. Case study of very early onset schizophrenia, and the Freeman et al. Key study of persecutory ideation. So let us begin with the first topic, ICD-11 criteria. For every disorder in the textbook you are given ICD-11 criteria. For exam point of view, it is very important to memorize the duration given, minimum duration for diagnosis of the disorder, and the minimum number of symptoms for the diagnosis. Also, definitions of symptoms given in the ICD you should try to memorize as much as possible, or else if you're writing in your own words, you should write with good terminology. If you want tips on how to write in the exam or how to practice for the exam, you can watch some of the other videos in my channel. This video is going to be more focused on an explanation. First, let us look at some key diagnostic points which are given for the ICD, in the ICD for schizophrenia. As I just mentioned, we have to know how many minimum symptoms are needed for diagnosis. In the case of schizophrenia, that's one core symptom. Core symptom means positive and negative symptoms. Now, positive and negative symptoms are categories or groups of symptoms. So, from within them, at least one symptom must be present so that the psychologist can say definitively that the individual has schizophrenia. And that symptom, minimum one, even if there are more, they should be present for at least a duration of 1 month. This means that if the symptom is present for less than a month, the individual will not be given a diagnosis. Also, a psychologist must rule out other possibilities. The symptoms that we are going to see of this disorder can be caused by other conditions also. So just because someone is showing the symptoms does not mean that they have schizophrenia. They could be having some other condition. That needs to be ruled out by the psychologist. Now, what are these other possible conditions? One is substance misuse. The individual might be smoking, drinking, or abusing drugs, or they might be taking some medication for a genuine physical condition, but that might be causing side effects in the form of symptoms which are seen in schizophrenia, or the individual might have some physical condition, a byproduct of which is showing the symptoms of schizophrenia. So keeping all of this in mind, now we need to look at what are the core symptoms of the disorder. Many things are listed on this PPT. I will not be explaining all of them. You have to learn everything, like I said, that is in the textbook, but I need to keep the lesson brief. So I am going to be looking at positive and negative symptoms only. To begin with, if you don't know already, schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder. Simply saying, it is that disorder in which a person has lost contact with reality. The person has withdrawn into a fantasy world or an imaginary world of their own, and they no longer understand or process what is really happening around them. There are many such psychotic disorders, the most important one of which is schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenics tend to show positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms are signs which show the presence of abnormality. These are those signs that an individual shows which indicates that there is some problem with the individual. And negative signs are absence of normality. These are those signs that make you feel that the person is unlike normal people. So positive symptoms are those which are not found in normal people but are found in schizophrenics. And negative symptoms are those which are found in normal people but are not found in schizophrenics. Let us look at two most prominent examples of positive symptoms. One is hallucination. As I mentioned earlier, try to memorize the definition or else write with good terminology. Do not write in casual terms. A hallucination is an involuntary perceptual experience in the absence of external stimuli. In simple words, something is not there, yet the individual can see it, smell it, feel it, hear it, or sense it in any way. Here, common examples are hearing voices. An individual suffering from schizophrenia might say things like, they can hear their long lost or long passed away ancestors speaking to them. So they might be actually hearing a lost grandfather or grandmother speaking to them. That is hearing voices. Of course, no one else can hear those voices because they are not actually there. Yet the patient can hear them, suggesting that there is some abnormality present in the individual, which is why this is a positive symptom. Another example is seeing things. A schizophrenic might insist in their own room, in their home, they can see a lion or a tiger in front of them. And they might be very scared looking at that. No one else can see the lion or tiger because there is none. Yet the individual can see it. That's why it's a hallucination. The other positive symptom, which is most commonly found, is a delusion. A delusion is a fixed, that is rigid, and false belief that is not true. A schizophrenic can come to believe something which is not what is true, and no matter how much proof or evidence is given to the individual, they would be unwilling to change that belief. So let's say, for example, a schizophrenic has come to believe that their partner is cheating on them. No matter how much the partner explains to them that they haven't been hanging around with anyone else, they actually show them proof that they've been out for work, not with anybody else. They explain to the schizophrenic how much they actually love them. Nothing can convince the schizophrenic against that belief that the partner is cheating. That is the nature of rigidity in their beliefs. Now, there are some types of delusions as well. One common type is paranoia delusion. Paranoia means being suspicious or doubtful of others, as in the example which I just gave. Also, there is a study by Freeman et al., the key study. For that, knowing what a paranoid delusion is very important. Another example is delusion of grandeur. Grandeur just means importance, usually self-importance. Schizophrenics might believe that they are very important and definitely in a very disproportionate way. So for example, a schizophrenic might believe that they are the president of the country, or even that they are the son of God or something like that. That is how important they might feel a position they hold in this world. Now, coming to the negative symptoms. I've already discussed the meaning of negative symptoms, so I'm moving to the examples. I'm just marking 2 examples of each group of symptoms. That suffices for a 6 marks answer and should be enough even for 2 or 4 markers, though I would strongly recommend you do read about other positive symptoms also, like belief in passivity or external control. Those type of things could be asked in the paper. Coming to negative symptoms, one common negative symptom is flat affect. Affect just refers to emotion, and flat means dull or blunt. Normal people, when we look at us, we see that we give responses, emotional responses according to situations that are happening around us. So if just now someone is to tell me that I have topped the examination, I would be very happy. Maybe I would sing, jump around, call my friends and announce that I've come first. And if someone was to tell me that a near person has suffered from an illness or has expired, I would be very sad. I might start crying. I would feel very, very helpless. So these are normal human responses to situations, normal emotions. Schizophrenic people often do not show such emotions. So even if we share a good news or a bad news with them, they would not react at all. That is known as flat affect. Also, they tend to show avolition, which means a lack of motivation. All of us, when we get up in the morning, we have some goals for our day. We are not talking about large career goals or academic goals, just simple daily routine goals, such as I want to dress well and go outside to shop for groceries. I just want to sit and complete a few units of my studies. I just want to review a few units. Simple day-to-day chores. Schizophrenic people might not have any interest in completing everyday activities. They might have no purpose in their day. They might look disheveled when you see them. They might not even comb their hair or wear decent clothes because they don't care about how their day is going to go. That is known as purposelessness and lack of goal-directed activity. So this much is what we need to know mainly about the ICD-11. In this lesson, I have also included evaluation, because of which it might seem slightly longer. I could have condensed it into one video by skipping all the evaluation points. But knowing evaluation is extremely important to score well in the paper. A lot of the paper comes from evaluation rather than description. Also, the way I'm going to discuss here is also again going to be explanatory. If you want to know these points which I'm sharing here, how you're supposed to put them in an answer, that's very different from just understanding. So how they are to be written down in the paper, that you can learn from another video of mine. So you can check out my channel. Right now, just understand the strengths and weaknesses here. When it comes to the ICD-11, which we have just seen, one strength of it is, it requires only 1 month of symptoms for diagnosis. As we saw, the minimum duration is 1 month. There are some other systems of diagnosis as well, such as the DSM-5, which is used in America. In that system, the psychologist waits for the patient to show symptoms for at least 6 months before giving them a diagnosis. What happens is, the more that we wait for giving a diagnosis, the more that treatment gets delayed. Because unless the person has a diagnosis, we cannot begin with the treatment. And more that we delay treatment, worse that the person's condition becomes, which means that their chances of recovering from the disorder really fall. So in the case of ICD, because we give diagnosis quickly, treatment commences quickly, and the individual is likely to recover faster and better. Another strength of the ICD is improved reliability. In the earlier versions of the ICD, that is up to ICD-10, the number which is then in front of ICD indicates its addition or revision. So up to ICD-10, subtypes were recognized in schizophrenia. For example, a patient showing the prominent characteristic of paranoia would be called a paranoid schizophrenic, and a patient showing the prominent symptom of catatonia, too much or too little movement, would be called a catatonic schizophrenic. Eventually, they realized that these subtypes fluctuate quickly. Today, someone's chief symptom might be paranoia. Tomorrow, it might be catatonia. Of course, it won't change so quickly, but it does change. And so, giving subtypes is not useful because there's no consistency in the subtype that the individual is showing. So, this has been discarded in the ICD-11, which is a very good move because the unreliable part of the ICD has been done away with. Instead, now what is done is dimensional descriptors are used to indicate how severe the symptoms are. Today, instead of trying to identify which subtype of schizophrenia a person has, a clinical psychologist would look at how severe their various symptoms are. such as their positive symptoms are severe, not very severe, mild, moderate, and so forth. That is a better way of looking, a more reliable way of looking at the diagnosis, and also very useful for treatment, because then according to severity of symptoms, treatment can be selected. Coming to some weaknesses of the ICD, one is the symptoms given for schizophrenia tend to overlap with other disorders. For example, some of the negative symptoms that we have seen, such as lack of motivation or not wanting to interact with others, that is lack of social behavior, asociality. Such symptoms are found even in a disorder which is called depression, in which we see in the next unit. Now, if a psychologist assumes that these symptoms are indicative of depression and gives the diagnosis of depression to the patient, whereas actually they are showing negative symptoms of schizophrenia, that would mean misdiagnosis. That would mean the psychologist has not correctly identified which disorder is there, and that would make diagnosis invalid. Another problem is there is possibility of subjective interpretation. Cultural differences can impact how symptoms are seen. Let's say a psychologist is coming from the West. They have a Western orientation and they are dealing with patients from an Asian country, say from India. In India, out of religious beliefs, many people can claim that they can hear their ancestors speaking to them, or they can see their ancestors giving them blessings or warning them against some problems and so forth. This is a religious belief, and that's why it's very common in India. Now the question is, should we take this as a sign of hallucination? The person is hallucinating because they can hear or see their ancestors. That does not seem very appropriate. This is more of a cultural practice which is taking place. So if we assume that people in a certain culture are showing symptoms of schizophrenia, whereas they are just showing their cultural beliefs, that has potential for misdiagnosis. They would be inaccurately labeled as having schizophrenia. Okay, that was the ICD-11. Let's quickly move to the next topic, a case study by Aneja et al. On very early onset schizophrenia. This is an example study. If you want to know the difference between how you should approach example studies and case studies, you can watch some of my other videos. As of now, I can just tell you that when it comes to example studies, you need to know summaries, not every detail. Whereas for case studies, you have to know them in and out, just like you used to learn core studies last year. Let us understand a summary of Aneja et al. Study. Before we look at the study, for our understanding, not for the paper, we should know what is VEOS. Usually, schizophrenia begins in early to mid-20s for males and late 20s for females. Simply saying, schizophrenia commonly begins in adulthood. It is a very rare case that schizophrenia should begin in childhood for an individual. But if this is happening, it makes for an interesting case study. As we know, we use the research method of case study when we come across rare cases. Like last year, we have seen 𝗬𝗪𝗬𝗬𝗬 study of a rare type of phobia called button phobia. So that is why Aneja et al., these researchers came across a boy only 14 years who was showing symptoms of schizophrenia and was eventually diagnosed as having the disorder. They understood that this is a case of VEOS and they decided to study it in details. So this case study will help us understand that in the rare possibility that schizophrenia begins very early, what is the course of the disorder? So Aneja et al.'s aim was to see how a 14-year-old boy was suffering from schizophrenia. If we look at the background of the boy, he had a troubled home life. His father was aggressive and violent, which is why his mother had to leave him. And then the boy started living with his maternal grandparents. From that time onwards, from when he shifted to his grandparents' house, he started showing many symptoms of being mentally disturbed. He started showing problems in his schoolwork. His academic decline began from that point onwards. And he started showing gradually symptoms of schizophrenia. Initially, he showed symptoms which were interpreted as mood disturbances. He would be irritated, angry, he would scream and shout. Then slowly he started showing typical schizophrenia, positive and negative symptoms. Let us see 2 or 3 of those. We don't need to remember too many. One is the boy started showing auditory hallucinations. He used to hear voices that were teasing him, making fun of him. He also developed paranoid delusions. He started suspecting his mother and believing that she wanted to harm him. And he also started showing disorganized behavior. He used to laugh randomly, mutter randomly, and just scream. In fact, it used to look like he was laughing, muttering at unseen people, meaning that he was showing visual hallucinations also. Now looking at the treatment for the boy, initially because the doctors thought that the boy has mood issues. They understood that he's suffering from family disturbances and they would not expect a boy to have schizophrenia because, like we saw, it is a condition seen in adulthood. So they gave him mood stabilizers, assuming that maybe he has bipolar disorder or maybe he is going into depression because of what has happened in his family. As expected, this treatment did not work out. It worked out only very briefly because actually the boy had schizophrenia. So mood treatment could not work for him. Then eventually realizing that the treatment isn't working, they diagnosed him carefully and the doctors realized that actually he has very early onset schizophrenia. And then they improved treatment in a way that they hospitalized the boy and they administered him electroconvulsive therapy, which means shock therapy, which we get to learn about later in this unit. And then the boy's condition improved. So what we are learning from this case study is VEOS, if it occurs, can be quite severe, as in the case of this boy. He showed a lot of positive symptoms which were very disturbing. Also, he showed negative symptoms which I did not go through. And treatment also can be required to be very intensive, as in the case of this boy. He had to be hospitalized. Okay, now let's go through an evaluation of this study. If we look at the weaknesses of this study, firstly, it has limited generalizability. After all, it is the case of only one boy, and that too in India. India is a country where stigmatization is very high. So it is possible that the family faced a lot of ridicule and isolation from their community because their boy was suffering from the disorder. In Western cultures, where there is more knowledge about the disorder and less stigmatization, it is unlikely that we find a similar case there because their circumstances would be very different. So no doubt this case really helps us to understand that in a country like India, where a large section is still unaware about these disorders, how people would react, and maybe that was contributing to the boy's symptoms, but we would not obtain the same findings in another culture. So this limits generalizability. Another problem is the fact that in this country there is stigmatization and a case study is being done on the boy could further worsen the stigma that was associated with them. The case study being done, a lot of people would have come to know about it, and especially when the results were published, people would have read about the boy's condition and subject the family to further ridicule. That means some ethical harm could have been caused to the family by conducting this case study. If we read the case study published by Aneja et al., it is published along with 2 other cases. And enough details are not shared as to whether the parents, that is the mother of the boy, really consented for the study, how much she knew about what would come out. We don't have much clarity on that. So we are not very sure whether the researchers went about the study very ethically or not. In terms of ethical considerations, we can take this as weaknesses also. When we are using children in research, definitely we need to have consent. But what we can take only is proxy consent, because consent has to be taken from parents. It cannot be taken from the child. A particular concern when a child is suffering from a mental disorder is that the child's case needs to be dealt with very sensitively. The child's condition should not further aggravate because of the case study being conducted. So consent is very important, and even though consent cannot be taken from the child, at least the child should understand what will happen in the study with him, why the study is being done, how the study could be beneficial to him or could cause certain harm to him. That is very important. As I mentioned previously, if we look at the Aneja et al. Study, we don't have sufficient details about whether all this was taken care of. But we can definitely say that it should have been taken care of. Let us now come to Freeman et al.'s key study in this area. I just used the term case study accidentally, and that reminds me that many students refer to key or core studies as case studies. Please remember, case study is a very specific research method in psychology, and we should not use the term loosely. Aneja et al. Qualifies for a case study. It's a very detailed study. Not every study is a case study. Freeman et al. Study is a correlational study. So do use the term case study. Many times when students communicate with me, they keep on saying case study. I get very confused what they are talking about. And then I realize they are referring to a case study. You're a student of psychology. Make sure you use correct terms. Okay, in this study, researchers were looking at one specific symptom of schizophrenia, which is persecutory ideation. So let's come to it. We have to know this study thoroughly. A lot of details are not there on this slide, which are there on the textbook, and you have to learn from there. One aim of this study was to see whether mentally healthy people can experience persecutory thoughts in response to non-threatening virtual avatars. Mentally healthy individuals, when we talk about here, we are referring to those who are not suffering from schizophrenia. Now we would wonder, in a unit of schizophrenia, why do we have participants who are not schizophrenic? The reason is because people having schizophrenia already have too many symptoms. So if we want to isolate two variables, one is going to be your paranoid tendencies and the other is going to be persecutory ideation. Basically, researchers want to see whether being paranoid can result in having persecutory ideation. Now, if they were to take schizophrenic individuals in the study, besides paranoia, they have many other symptoms. So they would not be able to clearly see the relationship between these two variables. Too many variables would be interfering in between, or you could say there would be too many third variables. So it was best to take healthy individuals. Now, what do we mean by triggering persecutory thoughts? Persecutory thoughts means thoughts of harm. Thoughts that another person wants to harm me. That is known as persecutory thought. And non-threatening virtual avatars means when we enter virtual reality, which is like a make-believe computer simulation, which seems very real because we get totally immersed in like a 3D experience. You must have seen people wearing Google glasses or the typical headgear for VR. I would recommend strongly either you see Professor Roberts' textbook or Professor Kitching et al.'s textbook. These two textbooks are excellent. You would get some images from the Freeman et al. Study, which will help you understand better how people wear headgear, that is goggles, and they use game controller type of joysticks to navigate in a virtual reality environment. In this virtual environment, in this study, there were going to be avatars. Avatars are human-like figures in the virtual reality situation. So researchers were going to ask healthy individuals to enter this virtual situation by neutral avatars, meaning not having any angry expressions or provocative expressions, were going to be sitting there, and they wanted to see whether those amongst the normal people who are little paranoid or suspicious by nature, they would come to believe that the avatars want to harm them. Understand one thing, that even people who don't have schizophrenia can be a little paranoid. Normal people like us, some of us are more suspicious and doubting of others compared to other people, others amongst us. So these are the people amongst us who are little suspicious, who are expected to believe that the avatars want to harm them in this study. The other aim is related to this, to assess if pre-existing paranoia, as I said, suspiciousness, and emotional distress, meaning anxiety, can amplify this effect, can increase this effect. in the sense that people who are anxious by nature or who are paranoid by nature, they are the ones who will feel that the avatars want to harm them. As we see the procedure, the aims will become more clear, but first let us note the methodology. This is a simple correlational study. As we know, in a correlational study, we have to have quantitative data. So questionnaires have been mainly used. There are interviews as well, which have been transformed into quantitative data for correlational analysis. In the sample, there are 24 mentally healthy volunteers from University College London. 12 are male, 12 are female, mean age is 26 years. Some of these are students, in fact the majority are students of the university, and there are only 3 administrative staff. Whichever details I am saying orally but are not written here are all there in the textbook. You must learn from them. Now let us see what is done in this study. Firstly, all 24 participants were given training in VR, how to wear the headgear and how to use the controller to move around in the VR environment. Next, half of them had to answer certain questionnaires. Why, we will see in the evaluation. Why only half had to answer? These questionnaires had to do with BSI and anxiety. All the details of these questionnaires, like Spielberg State Anxiety Questionnaire, are there in the textbook. You must learn from there. You must know all the details. I'm repeatedly emphasizing this. In the May 2024 paper, there was a lot of questions on VR paranoia questionnaire, which was designed by the researchers. And many students were not able to answer those questions because they did not take the unit seriously. So don't be in that mood that you can just take an overview and be able to answer the paper well. That is not going to happen. So BSI was one question and anxiety was another. Both measure emotional distress. And paranoia scale was there, which measures paranoia. Why they are measuring these things, we saw in the aim of the study. So they were just trying to find out which participants were high on emotional distress and paranoia. Then they made the participants enter the VR setting. In this study, the VR setting was a library. So researchers had computer simulated a library. In that library, there were 2 benches there were 2 tables, and on one table 3 avatars were sitting, and at another table 2 avatars were sitting. They were having neutral expressions, they were non-threatening. Occasionally it would look like they're smiling and their lips would move a little, which would make it look like they were talking. Now participants had been told that they just have to take a walk around the library virtually, and they have to think about what are their impressions of the avatars and what they feel the avatars are thinking about them. So that was the participants' task. After that, participants had to answer all those questionnaires which we saw previously. This time all participants had to answer the questionnaires. So those half who had answered earlier and the remaining half, they answered the BSI, anxiety and paranoia questionnaires. Besides that, all the participants had to answer a new VR paranoia scale. What we mean by this new scale is that the researchers have created this scale only for the purpose of this study. It was not a well-established measure of VR paranoia. What the scale is, how many items are there, which types of items are there, all the details are in the textbook. You have to memorize all those details, and you have to memorize some of the items from the table. Then after doing all of this, participants were in the VR environment for 5 minutes. I forgot to mention that. Then they answered the questionnaires like we saw. VR paranoia scale was seeing what they thought about the avatars. What was their experience in the VR environment? That was measured on the scale. The same thing was measured on a semi-structured interview. So after answering the questionnaires, the participants had to sit with an interviewer and answer some questions about VR experience. This interview was videotaped and it was submitted to an expert clinical psychologist who saw each participant's interview and rated each participant's discussion on a scale from 0 to 6, which would indicate how paranoid or how much persecutory ideation the clinical psychologist felt that the participant had in the VR environment. 6 would indicate too much of persecutory ideation and 0 would indicate none. So this is the procedure of the study. Let's see what was found. In the textbook, all the correlation figures are there. Mean paranoia figure is there. You must memorize all of that. Also, some of the negative and positive comments on the interview by the participants, you must memorize. Overall, they have found that paranoia scores are less in the sample. That is as expected because these are normal individuals. These are not schizophrenic individuals. So normal individuals tend to be less paranoid by nature. So overall, people were not very doubting of the avatar's intentions. One thing we must remember, avatars cannot have intentions. They are just pre-programmed animations. So anything that the participant is thinking about the avatars, suppose a participant thinks they were friendly towards me, that is the participant's own projection of their own thinking. In the same way, if the participant thinks that they wanted to harm me, that is the projection of the participant's own paranoia. Overall, people are less paranoid in the normal population, which is why not many people reported having negative thoughts about the avatars. Some did have some negative beliefs about the avatars. Now, very important, because this was a correlational study, are the correlational results. Positive correlation was found between many variables. Firstly, it was found that persecutory thoughts were positively correlated with ideas of reference. In the VR paranoia scale, which we saw earlier, persecutory thoughts were measured, meaning again thoughts that avatars wanted to harm the person. This was measured on the first 5 items. Ideas of reference was measured on the next 5 items. Reference is just like personalization, believing that not necessarily the avatars were trying to harm the person, but that the avatars were referring to the person, talking about the person or looking at the person in some way. What was found was that those who tend to have more persecutory ideas about the avatars also tend to believe more that the avatars are referring to them. That means these two variables go hand in hand. Next thing was found that those who have persecutory thoughts, as seen on the questionnaire, the VR paranoia scale, they also were found to get higher ratings by the clinical psychologist on the semi-structured interview. We've already seen that the paranoia scale and the semi-structured interview are measuring the same thing, how much persecutory ideation a person is having. So both went hand in hand. Those who scored high on the persecutory thought scale also got high ratings from the psychologist, meaning that the questionnaire was a good measure. The self-report means, though it was a self-report questionnaire, still it accurately measured how much persecutory ideation a person has, because it is validated against a clinical psychologist's judgment. Finally, VR paranoia also, VR paranoia just means the same thing, VR persecutory thoughts, was also positively correlated with anxiety and interpersonal sensitivity, as expected by the researchers. So researchers believed that those who have general emotional distress, as we saw in the aims, who tend to be anxious, they are the ones who will feel that the avatars want to harm them. And this was indeed the case, because both went hand in hand. Now let us look at the conclusions. So what we draw from this study is indeed an individual's own qualities, like their own paranoid thinking, their own emotional distress, makes them paranoid about avatars, makes them doubt the intentions of avatars. And also virtual reality has good potential for diagnosis and intervention. In this study, they made effective use of virtual reality. They did not expose participants to actual human figures. Still, they were able to measure their paranoia. So that means VR can be as good, if not better, than exposing people to real environments. Why I would say better is because VR can be customizably programmed. So researchers can create environments that they wish to using VR. So one is that can be very effective. It's as good as exposing participants to real people, especially in the case of schizophrenics who tend to become very upset upon being exposed to real people. Exposing them to VR could be a better idea. In the paper, often they ask a question of why VR could be a better means than actual exposure. you must have 2 or 3 points ready in your mind from the textbook. And also, of course, in this study they haven't done it, but future therapy is possible. What if we repeatedly expose participants to the VR, to the avatars, and make them see for themselves that the avatars do not intend to harm them by repeatedly exposing them? That would make for a very good therapy. Perhaps it would reduce their persecutory ideation. That potential we get to see in this study. Let us quickly go through an evaluation of the Freeman et al. Study. One strength is that they have made use of nomothetic and idiographic approaches. Do revise your issues and debates in general before you see them in the context of any particular topic's evaluation. Nomothetic approaches are those which find out common patterns across many participants so that generalizability to population increases. Basically, it's all about finding common trends. So in this study, when they used VR paranoia questionnaire, even the other questionnaires, but VR paranoia more so because it was the main measure, which was looking at what they thought in the VR environment. We see a nomothetic approach has been used because they tried to find out on an average how many participants are agreeing with, say, statement 1, how many are agreeing with statement 2. So they were trying to find out averages, common trends in the data. But they've also used idiographic approach. They did conduct semi-structured interviews with the participants. Undoubtedly, they converted the qualitative data obtained from interviews into quantitative data as well. So in a sense, they converted it to a nomothetic, we can say nomothetic data. But they have retained as secondary analysis some of the positive and negative comments made by the participants. That means they have looked at unique thinking patterns. Idiographic approach is that which looks at unique behavior, and the aim is not to generalize to others. So comments made by individual participants reflected their own thinking, and that was the idiographic approach taken. Since the study has taken both nomothetic and idiographic approach, we can say that it is holistic in nature, or it makes for more comprehensive understanding of paranoia and persecutory ideation. Also in this study, we see that there was no priming effect. Firstly, what do we mean by priming? Priming just means becoming ready or prepared to perceive things in a certain way. In this study, we see half the participants had to answer all those questionnaires like BSI and state anxiety questionnaire and so forth before they could enter the VR, and then all of them did answer it later as well. The question is, why make half of them answer the questionnaires first? Researchers felt that it can so happen not because of exposure to VR environment, but because of the wording on the questions. Participants could have become ready to perceive the avatars negatively. For example, if you answer a questionnaire on which there are words like doubt, a question might be, do you doubt others? There are words like stress. Do you get stressed very easily? Do you become anxious very easily? When you see so many negative words on questions, negative words prime you to perceive your environment negatively. So it should not be the case that because of reading such words, participants are saying that they felt the avatars were negative. So what researchers did, they compared the data obtained from those half of participants who answered before to all of the data by all participants when they answered later. If this is true, if some type of priming is taking place because of negative words, then these half participants should have perceived the avatars more negatively than the other half who answered only later. But that was not found to be the case. That means priming did not take place. The order of administering the questionnaire did not matter, whether it was given before entering VR or after entering VR. So that is something that increases validity. Another strength is ethical considerations are kept in place in this study, because one thing is, in terms of the main ethic, which is psychological harm, we see participants' anxiety levels were stable. What researchers did was, since they had administered questionnaires of anxiety to participants, before and after for some of them who answered twice. They just compared and saw on the questionnaires, was there any indication of anxiety increasing after being exposed to VR? And they did not find that to be the case. Participants who were a little more anxious earlier were equally as anxious after being exposed to the avatars, and those who were not anxious to begin with were not anxious even after being exposed to the avatars. So participants have been protected from psychological harm, or we can say that the VR environment was not harmful in any way. Of course, participants who doubted the avatars, who had persecutory ideation, they must have felt very uncomfortable being exposed to the VR, but otherwise it was fine. Coming to applications or practical use of this study, as we noted in the conclusion, VR has potential for therapy for those who have persecutory ideation, meaning patients of schizophrenia. For them, repeated exposure to avatars could be helpful to make them realize that the avatars are harmless, and for them to eventually understand that it is their own thinking that is paranoid and not the behavior of avatars. So it can result in some good exposure therapy. Also, the study has good explanatory power. It has shown individual traits like paranoia and anxiety or emotional distress can result in persecutory ideation. At the same time, just because people are paranoid or emotionally distressed does not mean automatically they keep on thinking that others want to harm them. It is upon exposure to VR that they start thinking this way. So somewhere that situational factor of exposure also plays a role in persecutory ideation. The researchers have demonstrated both in their study. So again, it's comprehensive and this counts as a strength. Coming to the weaknesses, a very important weakness is participants did not feel fully immersed in the VR environment. Today, VR has really improved compared to when the study was done in the 2000s. At that time, VR animations were not very realistic. So when participants of this study were asked that did they feel like they were in a real library, many of them said no. So their average rating of presence, or how much they felt immersed or absorbed into the environment, is less than half. On a scale of 6, it's 2.3 on average. So now the question that comes is of generalizability to real settings. At large, we saw participants were not paranoid in VR environment. Now, would that be true in a real library or a similar setting as well? And those who did experience persecutory ideation in the VR library, would they experience it even in a real library? A real experience is very different from a VR one. Real experience means fully absorbing all our senses into where we are, and real individuals, unlike avatars, do not behave in pre-programmed ways. They can be very unpredictable. They have a variety of expressions on their face compared to the avatars. What they speak can be listened to also. So the experience of seeing real people in a real library does not match that of a pre-programmed VR environment. So the study suffers in terms of ecological validity. Coming to, there is also sampling bias. Only London University students and 2 or 3 staff members were represented. They might not represent the wider population. In general, it is found students are less paranoid by nature as compared to working individuals, because students have not gone out to work as of yet. Once people start working, it is found that they do become a little, we won't say exactly suspicious, but wary of others, because a number of negative experiences do come in most people's way. So many people outside of the student population will be found to be paranoid. So results obtained from students might not generalize to those people, which results such as overall there being less paranoia, or there being a tendency to perceive the avatars positively, might not be so much so if we are talking about non-students. And one more weakness of the study in terms of ethics, though the larger ethic of harm was maintained, in the sense that harm was not caused. But when it comes to informed consent, there we see participants were only told about partial purpose of the study, that it is some VR study. They were not informed that their persecutory ideation will be measured and it will be correlated with their emotional distress and paranoia. So we can say partial consent was taken, not full informed consent. And that is an ethical weakness of the study. Okay, that is it for this video. I will try to upload part 2 soon, in which I will cover the next 3 subtopics to do with explanations of schizophrenia. If you have any comments or questions about this video, please leave them in the comment box below. Okay, I will see you soon.